Welcome to another journey into the forgotten corners of the American frontier, where kindness could be a man's greatest virtue or his final mistake. Before we dive into this tale of isolation, hospitality, and the terrible price of loneliness, I want you to drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. These dark stories from the Old West seem to find their way across the world, and I'm curious how far they travel. In the bitter winter of 1883, deep in the cattle country of eastern Wyoming Territory, a story unfolded that would challenge everything the local settlers thought they knew about good and evil, about the nature of hospitality, and about the things that walk the earth when decent folks are asleep in their beds. This is the documented account of what became known as the Devil's Creek Incident, a tale that begins with Christian charity and ends with questions that no God-fearing person should ever have to ask. The Wyoming Territory in 1883 was still wild country, a place where the railroad had brought some civilization, but hadn't tamed the vast emptiness that stretched between the scattered towns and ranches. It was a land of endless wind, brutal winters, and distances so great that a man could disappear without a trace, and no one would think to look for him until spring came and revealed what the snow had hidden. The territory had been officially organized in 1868, carved out of portions of Dakota, Utah, and Idaho territories, but 15 years later it still felt like the edge of the world. The Union Pacific Railroad had crossed the southern portion of the territory in 1869, bringing with it the promise of progress and prosperity, but the vast majority of the land remained as wild and untamed as it had been when only the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho called it home. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had brought waves of prospectors and settlers, but most of them passed through Wyoming on their way to richer strikes in Dakota Territory or Colorado. Those who stayed were a hardy breed, men and women tough enough to endure the isolation, the brutal weather, and the constant threat of Indian raids that still plagued the more remote areas. 40 miles northeast of what would eventually become the town of Douglas, along a creek that ran red with iron deposits and earned the name Devil's Creek from the local Lakota, stood the modest ranch of Ezra Blackwood. At 38 years old, Blackwood was what folks called a God-fearing man, a former preacher who had come west not seeking gold or adventure, but fleeing from a tragedy that had shattered his faith and left him questioning everything he had once believed about divine providence. Ezra Blackwood had been born in Ohio in 1845, the son of a Methodist minister who had instilled in him a deep and abiding faith in the goodness of God and the ultimate meaning of human suffering. He had followed in his father's footsteps, attending seminary and accepting a calling to minister to a small congregation in Lawrence, Kansas, where he had met and married Mary Catherine Wells, the daughter of a local merchant. For 5 years, Blackwood had been a model of Christian virtue, beloved by his congregation for his passionate sermons and his genuine care for the spiritual welfare of his flock. He and Mary had been blessed with a daughter, little Elizabeth, who had been the light of their lives and the embodiment of everything they believed about God's love and providence. But in the summer of 1879, cholera had swept through Lawrence, claiming hundreds of lives, including those of Mary and Elizabeth. Blackwood had watched helplessly as his wife and daughter wasted away despite his prayers, despite the prayers of his entire congregation, despite his absolute faith that God would not take the innocent while leaving the guilty to prosper. The loss had shattered something fundamental in Blackwood's worldview. He had continued to preach for several months after the funeral, but his sermons had become increasingly dark and questioning, filled with doubts that his congregation found disturbing. When he had finally stepped down from his pulpit in the spring of 1880, no one had been surprised, though many had been saddened by the loss of a man they had considered a pillar of their community. Blackwood had sold everything he owned in Kansas and headed west, seeking solitude and perhaps some kind of answer to the question of why a merciful God would take the innocent while leaving the wicked to prosper. He had built his ranch with his own hands, working from dawn to dusk to exhaust himself enough that he might sleep without dreaming of the family he had buried. The Blackwood Ranch was a testament to one man's determination to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. The cabin was solid and well built, constructed of thick pine logs that Blackwood had cut himself from the forests in the nearby hills. The walls were chinked with mud and moss to keep out the wind, and the roof was covered with sod that would provide insulation during the brutal Wyoming winters. The main room of the cabin served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a massive stone fireplace that Blackwood had built from rocks he had gathered from the creek bed. The fireplace was large enough to heat the entire cabin, and could accommodate logs up to 6 feet in length, ensuring that there would always be warmth even during the worst storms. A small bedroom opened off the main room, barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers, but adequate for a man living alone. Above the main room was a loft that Blackwood used for storage, accessible by a ladder he had crafted from lodgepole pine. The loft held his winter supplies, extra clothing, and the few books he had brought with him from Kansas, including his father's Bible and a collection of theological works that he could no longer bear to read. The barn was perhaps even more impressive than the cabin, a structure large enough to shelter his small herd of cattle during the worst storms. Blackwood had built it into the side of a hill, using the natural slope to provide additional protection from the wind. The barn was divided into several sections, with stalls for horses, pens for cattle, and storage areas for hay and grain. The corral was constructed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a man who took pride in his work, even if that work was all he had left to give meaning to his life. The fence posts were set deep and true, the rails fitted with precision joints that would withstand the pressure of cattle trying to break free during storms. Gates were hung with hand-forged hinges that Blackwood had made himself at a forge he had built behind the barn. What made Blackwood unusual among the isolated ranchers of the territory was his unwavering commitment to the Christian principle of hospitality. Despite his crisis of faith, despite the bitterness that had driven him from his calling, he could not bring himself to turn away a traveler in need. His cabin sat along one of the few reliable routes between the Union Pacific Railroad and the scattered ranches to the north, making it a natural stopping point for anyone brave enough to travel that desolate country. The route that passed by Blackwood's ranch was known as the Deadwood Trail, though it was little more than a series of wagon ruts and horse tracks that wound through the prairie grass and sagebrush. The trail had been established by freight haulers and cattle drivers, who needed a way to move goods and livestock between the railroad and the mining camps and ranches that dotted the northern reaches of the territory. Travel along the Deadwood Trail was dangerous at the best of times. The route passed through territory that was still claimed by various Indian tribes, and raids were not uncommon. The weather could turn deadly without warning, with blizzards that could bury a man and his horse in minutes, or summer thunderstorms that brought hail the size of hens' eggs, and lightning that could kill a man or start prairie fires that burned for days. But perhaps the greatest danger was simply the vastness of the country itself. A man could ride for days without seeing another human being, and if his horse went lame or he became lost, he could die of thirst or exposure before anyone found him. The scattered ranches and way stations along the trail were literally lifelines for travelers. The difference between life and death for those caught in bad weather or other emergencies. The territorial newspaper, the Cheyenne Leader, had mentioned Blackwood in an 1882 article about frontier hospitality, describing him as a man whose door is always open to the weary traveler, whose table has never failed to provide sustenance to those in need, regardless of their station or circumstances. It is said that he has fed everyone from circuit judges to cattle rustlers, asking no questions and expecting no payment beyond the simple gratitude of a fellow human being. The article had gone on to describe Blackwood's ranch as a beacon of civilization in the wilderness, a place where the Christian virtues of charity and hospitality were practiced without regard for personal cost or convenience. The writer had noted that Blackwood never asked travelers about their business or their past, understanding that many who came west were seeking to escape something and deserved the chance to start fresh without judgment. This reputation for kindness was both blessing and burden for Blackwood. While it brought him the human contact he craved in his isolation, It also attracted attention from those who might seek to take advantage of his generosity. But Blackwood seemed to understand this risk and accept it as part of the price of maintaining his humanity in a land that seemed designed to strip it away. His personal journal, discovered years later among his effects, reveals a man struggling with profound questions about the nature of good and evil, about whether acts of kindness had any meaning in a world that seemed fundamentally cruel. The journal, written in Blackwood's careful script, provides a window into the mind of a man wrestling with the deepest questions of human existence. In an entry dated August 15, 1882, he wrote, "Another traveler passed through today, a young man heading north to seek work on the cattle ranches. Fed him and gave him a place to sleep, as I have done for so many others. He thanked me with tears in his eyes, said it was the first kindness he had been shown in weeks of travel. Perhaps this is my calling now, not to preach about God's love, but to show it in small ways to those who need it most. If I cannot understand why God allows suffering, perhaps I can at least try to alleviate some small portion of it." But Blackwood's journal also reveals the toll that isolation was taking on his mind and spirit. As the months passed, his entries became increasingly dark, filled with doubts not just about God's plan, but about his own sanity. The vast emptiness of the Wyoming prairie seemed to press down on him like a physical weight, and the silence was so complete that he sometimes found himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. In an entry from November 3, 1882, he wrote, "The silence here is like a living thing, pressing down on a man until he begins to hear voices in the wind, until he starts talking to himself just to remember what human speech sounds like. Sometimes I wonder if I am going mad, if the grief has finally broken something in my mind that cannot be repaired. I find myself having conversations with Mary and Elizabeth, speaking to them as if they were sitting here beside me. I know they are dead. I know they cannot hear me, but the need for human contact is so strong that I cannot help myself." The isolation was made worse by the fact that Blackwood's nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and even they were often absent for weeks at a time, driving their cattle to market or visiting family in more settled areas. During the winter months, Blackwood might go for weeks without seeing another human being, with only his cattle and horses for company. The winter of 1882 had been particularly harsh, with blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low that Blackwood had to bring his cattle into the barn to keep them from freezing. During one storm in January, he had been snowed in for nearly 3 weeks, with no contact with the outside world except for the occasional wolf howl in the distance. When the snow finally melted enough for him to ride to his nearest neighbor's place, he found that the family had packed up and headed back east, unable to endure another winter in the territory. The Henderson family had been good neighbors, always willing to help during emergencies, and grateful for Blackwood's assistance when they needed it. Their departure left him feeling more isolated than ever. His journal entry from February 14, 1883, reveals the depth of his despair. The Hendersons are gone, their cabin standing empty like a monument to broken dreams. I rode past it today and felt the weight of the silence like a physical thing. The windows stare out at the prairie like dead eyes, and the wind whistles through the gaps in the walls with a sound like mourning. Sometimes I think I am the last man left in this part of the territory, the last soul clinging to a land that God has forgotten." The entry continues, "I have been reading Job again, trying to understand how a man can maintain his faith in the face of seemingly senseless suffering. But Job had friends, even if they were poor comforters. Job had a community, people who knew him and cared about his fate. I have only the wind and the endless sky, and the growing certainty that I am utterly alone in a universe that is indifferent to my existence." It was against this backdrop of crushing loneliness and spiritual crisis that the events of December 1883 began to unfold. The first major storm of the season had arrived early, dumping 3 feet of snow across the territory, and warning of the brutal winter to come. Blackwood had spent the day checking on his cattle, making sure they had access to the hay he had stored for the long months ahead. The storm had come in from the northwest, as they usually did, building slowly throughout the day until by evening the wind was howling like a living thing, and the snow was falling so heavily that Blackwood could barely see from his cabin to his barn. He had made one final trip to check on his animals, fighting his way through drifts that were already knee-deep and growing deeper by the hour. As evening approached and the snow continued to fall, he was in his cabin preparing a simple supper, when he heard something that made him pause. It was the sound of a horse approaching through the storm, the muffled thud of hooves in deep snow. In weather like this, only a desperate man would be traveling, and Blackwood felt his heart quicken with both anticipation and concern. He set down the pot he had been stirring and moved to the window, wiping away the frost that had accumulated on the glass. Outside, the world was a swirling mass of white, and at first he could see nothing but the storm itself. But as he watched, a dark shape began to materialize out of the snow, moving slowly but steadily toward his cabin. The rider was still too far away to see clearly, but he appeared to be alone, which was unusual and dangerous in such weather. Most travelers would seek shelter and wait for a storm to pass rather than risk becoming lost in the blinding snow. The fact that this man was continuing to travel suggested either desperation or foolhardiness, and Blackwood felt a surge of concern for the stranger's welfare. He stepped out onto his porch, pulling his coat tight against the wind, and peered through the swirling snow. The rider was closer now, and Blackwood could see that he was indeed alone, mounted on a dark horse that struggled through the deep drifts. The man himself was tall and thin, wrapped in a long coat that was white with accumulated snow. He rode with the careful precision of someone who knew that a single mistake could mean death in such conditions. When the stranger was close enough to speak, he called out through the storm, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Hello, the house. I'm seeking shelter from this storm. Can you spare a place by your fire for a traveler in need?" The words were formal, almost archaic in their phrasing, but they carried the desperate edge of a man who knew he was in mortal danger. Blackwood felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with the opportunity to help someone. Here was a chance to do good, to show kindness to a fellow human being in distress, to prove to himself that his faith in human decency still had meaning even if his faith in God had been shattered. "Come ahead," he called back, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "There's room in the barn for your horse and a place by the fire for you. You're welcome to whatever I have." The stranger rode up to the cabin and dismounted stiffly, as if he had been in the saddle for many hours. As he led his horse toward the barn, Blackwood got his first good look at the man. He appeared to be in his 40s, with dark hair that showed beneath his snow-covered hat, and a face that was pale and gaunt, as if he had been traveling for a long time without proper rest or nourishment. "Name's Josiah Crane," the stranger said as they settled his horse in the barn. "I'm much obliged for the shelter. This storm came up faster than I expected." His voice was cultured, educated, with the slight accent of someone from the eastern states. But there was something else in his tone, something that Blackwood couldn't quite identify. It wasn't unfriendliness exactly, but there was a distance there, a sense that the man was holding something back. "Yezra Blackwood," Blackwood replied, extending his hand. "You're welcome to whatever I have. No man should be out in weather like this." Crane's handshake was firm but cold, even through his gloves, and Blackwood noticed that the man's eyes were an unusual pale gray, almost colorless. There was something about those eyes that made Blackwood uncomfortable, though he couldn't say exactly what it was. They seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if Crane was seeing something that existed beyond the physical world. "You've got a fine setup here," Crane said as they made their way through the snow to the cabin. "Must be good grazing in this area during the warmer months." "Oh, good enough," Blackwood replied. "Well, the grass is sparse, but it's nutritious. The cattle do well if you don't try to run too many head. I keep about 25, and that seems to be what the land will support." As they entered the cabin, Blackwood was struck by how the simple presence of another person seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the place. The rooms felt warmer, more alive, less like the tomb of solitude they had become during the long months of isolation. The very air seemed to vibrate with the possibility of conversation, of human connection, of relief from the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion. "Sit yourself down by the fire," Blackwood said, gesturing toward a chair near the stone fireplace. "I'll get some coffee going and see what I can put together for supper." Crane settled into the offered chair, and Blackwood noticed how the man's eyes moved constantly around the room, taking in every detail, noting the locations of doors and windows. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to always be aware of his surroundings, to always have an escape route planned. While this wasn't unusual on the frontier, where caution was often the difference between life and death, there was something about the intensity of Crane's observation that seemed to go beyond normal prudence. The chair that Crane had chosen was one of two that Blackwood had made himself during his first winter on the ranch. It was a simple design, constructed from pine with a high back and curved arms, but it was solid and comfortable. Blackwood had spent many evenings sitting in its companion chair, reading by the firelight or simply staring into the flames, and thinking about the life he had left behind in Kansas. "You live here alone?" Crane asked, and there was something in his tone that made Blackwood look up from the stove where he was preparing their meal. Yes," Blackwood replied. "I've been here about 4 years now. Built this place up from nothing." 4 years," Crane repeated thoughtfully. "That's a long time to be alone in a place like this. Don't you get lonely?" It was a simple question, but something about the way Crane asked it made Blackwood uncomfortable. There was an intensity in those pale eyes, a hunger that seemed to go beyond simple curiosity about his living situation. It was as if the man was probing for something, searching for some kind of weakness or vulnerability. Sometimes," Blackwood admitted, "but a man learns to find peace in solitude, especially when he's seeking answers to questions that can't be found in the company of others." Questions," Crane said, leaning forward slightly. What kind of questions?" Blackwood hesitated, unsure why he felt compelled to share his private struggles with a stranger. But there was something about Crane's presence that seemed to draw the words out of him, as if the man possessed some kind of magnetic pull that made confession inevitable. Perhaps it was simply the relief of having someone to talk to after so many months of silence, but Blackwood found himself wanting to unburden himself to this pale-eyed stranger. "Questions about the nature of God," Blackwood said finally. "About whether there's any purpose to suffering, any meaning to the pain that good people endure while evil seems to prosper." Crane smiled, and Blackwood noticed that the man's teeth were unusually white and sharp. "Ah, a crisis of faith. I've known many men who've wrestled with such questions. Tell me, what brought you to this particular crisis?" Against his better judgment, Blackwood found himself telling Crane about his past, about the wife and daughter he had lost, about the congregation he had abandoned, about the long journey that had brought him to this isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere. As he spoke, he noticed that Crane listened with an intensity that was both flattering and somehow unsettling, as if every word was being carefully catalogued and stored away for future use. The story poured out of him in a way that surprised even Blackwood himself. He told Crane about Mary's laugh, about the way she had hummed while she worked in their garden in Kansas. He described little Elizabeth's first steps, her first words, the way she had clapped her hands when he sang to her. He spoke of the cholera epidemic, of watching helplessly as his family wasted away, despite all his prayers, despite his absolute faith that God would not abandon the innocent. "So you came here seeking solitude," Crane said when Blackwood had finished his story, "seeking to escape from the pain of human connection." "I came here seeking answers," Blackwood corrected, "seeking to understand why a merciful God would allow such suffering." "Guide and have you found your answers?" Crane asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew what the response would be. "No, Hert," Blackwood admitted. "If anything, I have more questions now than when I started." Crane nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Perhaps that's because you're asking the wrong questions. Perhaps instead of asking why God allows suffering, you should be asking whether God exists at all." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. In all his months of doubt and questioning, he had never quite allowed himself to consider that possibility. Even in his darkest moments, he had assumed that God existed, but was simply incomprehensible or indifferent. The idea that there might be no divine presence at all, that the universe might be nothing more than a cold and empty void, was almost too terrible to contemplate. "You think I'm a fool for believing," Blackwood said, and there was a defensive edge to his voice. "Not a fool," Crane replied, "but perhaps naive, perhaps unwilling to accept the truth that's staring you in the face." "Oh, and what truth is that?" Crane's smile widened, and in the flickering light of the fire, his pale eyes seemed to glow with their own inner light. "That there is no God, that there is no divine plan, that the universe is ruled not by love and mercy, but by hunger and need, that the strong take what they want from the weak, and that's the only law that matters." Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. There was something in Crane's voice, something in the way he spoke about hunger and need, that made the hair on the back of Blackwood's neck stand up. The man's words seemed to carry a weight that went beyond mere philosophy, as if he was speaking from personal experience about things that no human being should know. "That's a dark philosophy," Blackwood said carefully. "But an honest one," Crane replied. "And honesty is something that's in short supply in this world, don't you think?" They prepared their supper together, with Crane proving surprisingly helpful in the kitchen. The man seemed to know his way around cooking utensils, and showed a familiarity with frontier cooking that suggested he had spent considerable time living rough. But there was something unsettling about the way he handled the knives, the casual ease with which he tested their sharpness against his thumb. The meal itself was simple but hearty: salt pork fried with potatoes, beans that had been soaking since morning, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Blackwood had learned to cook for himself during his years of isolation, and while his meals were not elaborate, they were filling and nutritious. They ate their supper in relative quiet after that, with Blackwood finding that his appetite had largely disappeared. Crane, on the other hand, seemed to eat with unusual enthusiasm, consuming his portion and asking for seconds, then thirds. Blackwood was happy to oblige, pleased to have someone appreciate his simple cooking, but there was something about the way Crane ate that troubled him. The man consumed his food with an intensity that suggested he hadn't eaten in days, yet he showed no signs of the weakness or fatigue that would normally accompany such deprivation. His movements were fluid and controlled, his hands steady, his eyes alert. It was as if the act of eating was giving him strength in some way that went beyond normal nutrition. "You're a good cook," Crane said, finishing his third helping. "It's been a long time since I've had a proper meal." "How long have you been traveling?" Blackwood asked. "Longer than you might think," Crane replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning that Blackwood couldn't quite grasp. After supper they sat by the fire sharing a bottle of whiskey that Blackwood had been saving for a special occasion. The presence of company seemed special enough to justify breaking it out. The whiskey was good quality, purchased from a traveling merchant the previous spring, and it warmed Blackwood's throat and loosened his tongue. As the evening wore on and the alcohol took effect, Blackwood found himself sharing thoughts and feelings that he had never expressed to another human being. The combination of isolation, grief, and whiskey created a perfect storm of emotional vulnerability, and Crane seemed to encourage his confessions with carefully placed questions and sympathetic nods. "You know what the worst part is?" Blackwood said, the whiskey making him more philosophical than usual. "Why, it's not the loneliness, or the doubt, or even the grief. It's the fear that none of it matters, that my wife and daughter lived and died for no reason, that my faith was nothing more than a comforting delusion, that everything I've built here will crumble to dust and be forgotten." Crane listened with that same intense attention he had shown earlier, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight like those of a nocturnal predator. "And if that's true?" he asked. If none of it matters, what then?" "Then I don't know how to go on," Blackwood admitted. "I don't know how to find the strength to face another day, another year, Another decade of emptiness. Perhaps, Crane said quietly, the answer is not to go on. Perhaps the answer is to embrace the emptiness, to stop fighting against the truth of what the world really is. There was something in his tone that made Blackwood look up sharply. In the firelight, Crane's face seemed to have changed somehow, become more angular, more predatory. His pale eyes reflected the flames like those of a nocturnal animal, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed longer and sharper than they had before. "What are you suggesting?" Blackwood asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. "I'm suggesting that you stop pretending," Crane said. "I'd stop pretending that kindness matters, that morality has any meaning, that there's any difference between good and evil, except the ability to take what you want." Blackwood felt his heart begin to race. There was something wrong here, something fundamentally wrong with this conversation, with this man, with the entire situation. But he found that he couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only sit and listen as Crane continued. "You've spent years helping travelers, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless," Crane went on. "And what has it gotten you? More loneliness, more doubt, more questions without answers. But what if I told you there was another way? What if I told you that you could take instead of give, that you could feed instead of being consumed?" "I don't understand," Blackwood managed to say, though his voice sounded strange and distant to his own ears. Crane leaned forward, and Blackwood could see that his pale eyes were indeed glowing with their own light, a cold, hungry light that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. You understand perfectly," Crane said. "You've always understood. You've just been too afraid to admit it." Blackwood tried to stand, tried to reach for the rifle that hung above the fireplace, but his body wouldn't obey him. He was frozen in place, trapped in his chair like a rabbit mesmerized by a snake. The whiskey seemed to have turned to lead in his veins, weighing him down and making movement impossible. "You see," Crane continued, his voice taking on a hypnotic quality, "I'm not really a traveler seeking shelter from the storm. I'm something much older than that, much hungrier. I'm the thing that feeds on faith, on hope, on the belief that goodness has any meaning in this world. And you, my dear Ezra, have been feeding me all evening with your doubts and your despair." As Crane spoke, his appearance began to change more dramatically. His skin became pale and translucent, revealing dark veins beneath. His fingers elongated into claws, and his teeth grew into fangs that gleamed in the firelight. But most terrifying of all were his eyes, which now burned with a cold fire that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, like watching a mask slowly slip away to reveal the true face beneath. What had appeared to be a man was revealed to be something else entirely, something that might once have been human, but had long since become something far more terrible. "What are you?" Blackwood whispered, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "I am what remains when faith dies," Crane replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "I am the hunger that fills the void left by lost belief. I am the thing that feeds on the spiritual emptiness of men like you, men who have given up on God, but haven't yet learned to embrace the darkness that remains." Blackwood felt something cold and sharp touch his throat, and he realized that Crane's clawed hand was now resting against his neck. The touch was gentle, almost caressing, but he could feel the razor-sharp points of the claws pressing against his skin. One small movement would open his throat and spill his life onto the floor of his own cabin. "Please," Blackwood said, though he wasn't sure what he was pleading for. "Please what?" Crane asked, tilting his head like a curious bird. "Please spare your life? Please don't take what little faith you have left? Please pretend that your God is real and that your suffering has meaning?" Blackwood tried to pray, tried to call upon the faith that had once sustained him. But the words wouldn't come. In the presence of this creature, this thing that claimed to feed on spiritual emptiness, he found that his doubts had crystallized into something approaching certainty. Perhaps Crane was right. Perhaps there was no God, no meaning, no purpose to any of it. "I can see it in your eyes," Crane said with satisfaction. the last of your faith dying, the final acceptance that you are alone in a universe that doesn't care whether you live or die. It's beautiful, in its way. The moment when a man finally stops lying to himself. Blackwood felt something fundamental shift inside him, as if a dam had burst, and all the doubt and despair he had been holding back came flooding through. The grief for his family, the loss of his calling, the years of isolation and questioning all combined into a crushing weight that seemed to press down on his very soul. The creature that had been calling itself Josiah Crane seemed to grow stronger as Blackwood's faith weakened, its form becoming more solid, more real. It was as if it was feeding on his despair, drawing sustenance from the collapse of his spiritual defenses. "Yes," Crane whispered, his claws tightening slightly against Blackwood's throat. "Let it go. Let all of it go. The pain, the hope, the desperate need to believe that any of it matters. Embrace the emptiness. Embrace the hunger." But as Blackwood felt himself slipping into that final despair, something unexpected happened. In the depths of his mind, he heard a voice, small and distant but unmistakably real. It was the voice of his wife, speaking the words she had said to him on her deathbed. "Faith isn't about having all the answers, Ezra. It's about choosing to believe in love even when the world seems loveless." The memory hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly he could move again. With a strength born of desperation, he threw himself backward in his chair, breaking free from Crane's grip, and tumbling to the floor. The creature that had been masquerading as a traveler let out a shriek of rage and frustration, a sound that was like nothing Blackwood had ever heard before. "You cannot escape what you are," Crane snarled, his form now fully revealed in all its terrible glory. "You cannot run from the truth of your own emptiness." But Blackwood was already moving, rolling across the floor toward the fireplace where his rifle hung. His hands closed around the weapon just as Crane lunged toward him, claws extended and fangs bared. Blackwood swung the rifle like a club, catching the creature across the side of the head and sending it sprawling. Crane recovered quickly, faster than any human could have, and came at Blackwood again. But this time, Blackwood was ready. He had managed to cock the rifle, and he fired point-blank into the creature's chest. The bullet seemed to have little effect, passing through Crane's body as if it were made of smoke, but it did cause him to hesitate for a moment. "Iron and lead cannot harm me," Crane said, his voice now a horrible rasping sound. "I am beyond such crude weapons." "Maybe," Blackwood said, backing toward the door. "But I'm betting you're not beyond fire." He grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and hurled it at Crane, who dodged with inhuman speed. But the log struck the wall behind him, and the dry wood immediately began to smolder. Blackwood grabbed another log and threw it, then another, until small fires were beginning to spread throughout the cabin. Crane let out another shriek, this one tinged with what might have been fear. "You'll burn yourself alive, you fool." "Maybe," Blackwood said, continuing to throw burning wood around the cabin. "But at least I'll die as a man, not as food for something like you." The fires were spreading quickly now, fed by the dry wood and the strong wind that was blowing through the gaps in the walls. Smoke was beginning to fill the cabin, and Blackwood could feel the heat growing more intense by the moment. But he didn't stop throwing burning logs until the entire cabin was ablaze. Crane seemed to be struggling now, his form becoming less solid, more translucent. The creature appeared to be weakening as the fires spread, as if the flames were somehow draining its power or forcing it to retreat. "This isn't over," Crane said, his voice fading. "There are others like me, others who hunger for what you carry. They will find you, no matter where you go." "Let them come," Blackwood said, though his voice was shaking. "I'll be ready." With a final shriek of rage, Crane's form dissolved entirely, leaving only a wisp of dark smoke that was quickly consumed by the growing flames. Blackwood didn't wait to see if the creature would return. He grabbed his coat and hat and rushed out into the storm, leaving his burning cabin behind. The snow was still falling heavily, and the wind was howling like a living thing, but Blackwood barely noticed. He made his way to the barn, where Crane's horse should have been, but found it empty. There were no tracks in the snow, no sign that a horse had ever been there at all. Blackwood saddled his own horse and rode out into the storm, not caring where he was going, knowing only that he had to get away from that place. Behind him, his cabin burned like a beacon in the darkness, the flames visible for miles across the empty prairie. He rode through the night, guided only by instinct and the desperate need to put distance between himself and whatever had happened in his cabin. The storm seemed to be following him, the wind always at his back, pushing him forward into the darkness. Several times he thought he heard voices in the wind, calling his name, but he didn't stop to listen. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the continuing snow, he found himself at the ranch of his nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, though he had thought their place was abandoned. To his surprise, he found the family very much in residence, and they welcomed him with the kind of hospitality that was common on the frontier. Mrs. Henderson tended to his frostbite, while her husband saw to his horse, and their children gathered around to hear his story. But when Blackwood tried to tell them what had happened, he found that the words wouldn't come. Every time he tried to describe Crane, to explain about the creature that had claimed to feed on lost faith, the memories seemed to slip away like smoke. All he could remember clearly was that he had been entertaining a traveler when a fire had broken out, forcing him to flee into the storm. The details of the encounter, the philosophical discussions, the terrifying transformation, all of it seemed to fade like a half-remembered dream. The Hendersons were sympathetic and offered to let him stay until the weather cleared. It was only when he was sitting by their fire, warming himself and trying to make sense of what had happened, that Mrs. Henderson made a comment that chilled him to the bone. "It's strange," she said, looking out the window toward where his ranch lay. "We've been watching that fire burn all night, but it seems to be moving. First it was in one place, then another, as if it was searching for something." Blackwood looked out the window and saw that she was right. In the distance, he could see flames dancing across the landscape, moving in patterns that defied explanation. They seemed to be following the route he had taken during his flight, as if something was tracking him through the snow. "We should probably ride over and see if we can help," Mr. Henderson said, but Blackwood quickly discouraged him. "No," he said, perhaps too quickly. "The fire's too dangerous, and the storm's too severe. We should wait until the weather clears." The Hendersons accepted this advice, but Blackwood could see the questions in their eyes. He spent the next 3 days with them, watching through the windows as the strange fires continued to move across the landscape, always seeming to search, always seeming to hunt. On the 4th day, the storm finally cleared, and Blackwood knew he could delay no longer. He thanked the Hendersons for their hospitality and set out to see what remained of his ranch. What he found there defied all logic and reason. The cabin was gone, burned to the ground as he had expected, but the fire had burned in a perfect circle, leaving the barn and corral completely untouched. In the center of the burned area where his cabin had stood was a single rocking chair, completely unharmed by the flames. Blackwood approached the chair cautiously, remembering Crane's final words about others who would come looking for him. As he drew closer, he could see that there was something carved into the back of the chair, symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly. But what truly terrified him was that the chair was rocking gently back and forth, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. And as he watched, frozen with fear, he could swear he heard a voice carried on the wind, a voice that sounded like Crane, but wasn't quite the same. "We know where you are now," the voice whispered. "We can smell the doubt on you, the fear, the growing certainty that your God has abandoned you. We will come for you, one by one, until you have nothing left to believe in." Blackwood turned and ran, not caring about his cattle or his possessions or anything else he was leaving behind. He rode hard for the nearest town, not stopping until he reached the safety of civilization, such as it was. But even in town, surrounded by other people, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, being hunted. Every stranger who passed through seemed to have pale eyes and sharp teeth. Every shadow seemed to hide something that hungered for his soul. He tried to rebuild his faith, tried to return to his calling as a preacher, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. The doubt that Crane had awakened in him continued to grow, fed by every tragedy he witnessed, every prayer that went unanswered, every good person who suffered while evil prospered. Within a year, Blackwood had left Wyoming Territory entirely, drifting from town to town, never staying long in any one place. Those who knew him said he had become a haunted man, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting something terrible to catch up with him. He tried various occupations, working as a school teacher in Colorado, a store clerk in Kansas, even a traveling salesman in Missouri. But no matter where he went or what he did, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being followed, that pale-eyed strangers were always just one step behind him. The last reliable account of Ezra Blackwood comes from a newspaper article in the Denver Post, dated March 15, 1885. The article describes a former preacher who had been found dead in his hotel room, apparently from natural causes, though the circumstances were unusual. According to the article, Blackwood had been found sitting in a rocking chair by the window, his eyes wide open and staring at nothing. The hotel staff reported that the chair had been rocking when they discovered the body, though there was no wind in the room to set it in motion. More disturbing still was the condition of the room itself. Despite the fact that it was early spring, the room was filled with snow that had apparently blown in through the closed window. The snow formed strange patterns on the floor, symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The coroner ruled the death natural, attributing it to heart failure brought on by extreme fear. But those who examined the scene noted that Blackwood's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, as if he had seen something so horrible that it had literally frightened him to death. The hotel staff reported that in the days leading up to his death, Blackwood had been acting strangely, talking to himself and insisting that someone was coming for him. He had barricaded his door and refused to let anyone into his room, surviving on food that he had stockpiled earlier. On the night he died, other guests reported hearing voices from his room, though the desk clerk insisted that Blackwood had been alone. The voices seemed to be having a conversation, though the words were in a language that no one recognized. The rocking chair in which Blackwood was found was examined by local authorities, but they could find nothing unusual about it, except for some strange symbols carved into the back. The chair was eventually sold at auction, but it changed hands several times over the next few years, as each owner reported disturbing experiences associated with it. The final owner, a furniture dealer named Morrison, claimed that the chair would rock by itself at night, and that he could sometimes hear whispers coming from it in the darkness. He eventually had the chair burned, but even then witnesses reported that the flames formed strange patterns as they consumed the wood, patterns that resembled the symbols that had been carved into its back. The story of Ezra Blackwood and his encounter with the creature calling itself Josiah Crane became part of local folklore in Wyoming Territory, though most people dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and grief. But there were those who believed that something genuinely supernatural had occurred at the Blackwood Ranch, that the former preacher had encountered one of the dark things that fed on human despair. Over the years, other travelers reported similar encounters in the area around Devil's Creek, stories of pale-eyed strangers who appeared during storms, offering philosophical discussions that led to spiritual crisis and sometimes death. The local Indian tribes began to speak of the area as cursed, a place where the spirits of doubt and despair had taken up residence. The Lakota called it Makasika, the bad land, and warned their people to avoid it at all costs. They spoke of pale spirits that walked the earth in human form, feeding on the faith and hope of those they encountered. According to their legends, these spirits had been banished from the spirit world for their crimes against the natural order, condemned to wander the earth in search of sustenance. In 1887, a group of territorial marshals investigated the area after receiving multiple reports of missing travelers. They found the remains of Blackwood's ranch, including the mysterious rocking chair that sat in the center of the burned circle. But when they tried to remove the chair, they reported that it became impossibly heavy, as if it was rooted to the spot. One of the marshals, a man named Deputy Collins, volunteered to spend the night at the site, hoping to witness whatever phenomenon was responsible for the strange reports. His colleagues found him the next morning, sitting in the rocking chair with his hair turned completely white, and his mind apparently shattered. Collins never spoke coherently again, but in his lucid moments, he would rock back and forth and whisper about pale-eyed strangers who came in the night to steal men's faith. He lived for another 5 years in this condition before finally dying in his sleep, and his last words were reported to be, "The chair is still rocking, and they're still coming." The official report on the investigation concluded that the area around Devil's Creek was unsuitable for settlement due to unstable geological conditions that might cause hallucinations or other psychological disturbances. The site was officially closed to settlement, and warning signs were posted to keep travelers away. But the stories persisted. Even today, there are those who claim that on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, you can see a pale light moving across the prairie near Devil's Creek. And if you're foolish enough to investigate, you might find a rocking chair sitting in the middle of nowhere, moving gently back and forth as if someone invisible is sitting in it. Local ranchers report that their cattle avoid the area entirely, refusing to graze anywhere near the site of the old Blackwood Ranch. And more than one traveler has reported encountering pale-eyed strangers on the roads near Devil's Creek, strangers who speak of philosophy and faith with an intensity that leaves their listeners questioning everything they once believed. The phenomenon seems to have spread beyond the original site over the years. Reports of similar encounters have come from across the Wyoming Territory and beyond, suggesting that whatever Blackwood encountered that night was not unique to Devil's Creek. Travelers from Colorado, Nebraska, and even as far away as Montana have described meetings with mysterious strangers who appeared during storms or in moments of personal crisis. These encounters follow a consistent pattern. The stranger appears when the victim is most vulnerable, usually during a time of spiritual doubt or emotional distress. They engage in philosophical discussions that gradually undermine the victim's faith and hope. Those who survive these encounters often report a profound crisis of faith that lasts for years, while others simply disappear without a trace. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a professor of folklore at the University of Wyoming who studied these accounts in the 1920s, noted several disturbing similarities between the various reports. The descriptions of these entities are remarkably consistent, she wrote in her 1923 paper, Supernatural Predation on the American Frontier. They appear to be drawn to individuals who are already struggling with questions of faith and meaning, suggesting either a supernatural ability to sense spiritual vulnerability or a very human understanding of psychological manipulation. Dr. Thornfield's research uncovered dozens of similar accounts dating back to the earliest days of westward expansion. She found reports of pale-eyed strangers in the journals of Oregon Trail pioneers, in the letters of California gold miners, and in the testimonies of survivors of various frontier disasters. The consistency of these accounts across time and geography suggested to her that they represented either a genuine supernatural phenomenon or a form of mass hysteria that had taken root in the collective unconscious of frontier society. One particularly disturbing case that Dr. Thornfield documented occurred in 1889 when an entire family named the Weatherbys disappeared from their homestead near the North Platte River. Neighbors found their cabin empty but undisturbed, with no signs of violence or struggle. The only clue to their fate was a rocking chair that had been placed in the center of their main room, carved with the same strange symbols that had been found at the Blackwood Ranch. The Weatherby case was investigated by federal marshals, who interviewed neighbors and searched the surrounding area for weeks, without finding any trace of the missing family. The investigation report, discovered in federal archives in 1954, contains a disturbing detail that was omitted from contemporary newspaper accounts. According to the report, several neighbors had seen a pale-eyed stranger visiting the Weatherby homestead in the days before the family's disappearance, a man who claimed to be a traveling preacher, but whose sermons left listeners feeling disturbed and spiritually empty. The marshal who led the investigation, a man named Samuel Garrett, wrote in his private notes, There is something unnatural about this case that defies rational explanation. The Weatherbys were a devout family, well regarded by their neighbors, with no reason to abandon their home and possessions. Yet they vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The only evidence of their fate is that accursed chair, which seems to mock our efforts to understand what happened here. Garrett's notes, discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1923, reveal that the investigation had a profound effect on his own faith and mental state. He wrote of sleepless nights, of dreams filled with pale-eyed figures who whispered doubts and accusations. Within a year of the Weatherby investigation, Garrett had resigned his position and retreated to a monastery in Colorado, where he spent the remainder of his life in prayer and contemplation. The pattern of spiritual corruption and psychological destruction associated with these encounters led some researchers to theorize that they represented a form of psychic vampirism, entities that fed not on blood, but on faith, hope, and spiritual energy. This theory gained credence when similar phenomena were reported in other parts of the world, suggesting that the American frontier was not unique in harboring such creatures. Father Miguel Santos, a Jesuit priest who ministered to frontier communities in the 1890s, wrote extensively about what he called demons of despair in his letters to the Vatican. According to Father Santos, these entities were drawn to areas where human suffering was most intense, feeding on the spiritual anguish of those who had lost their faith in divine providence. I have encountered these creatures in mining camps where men died in cave-ins, Father Santos wrote in a letter dated October 12, 1894. I have seen them in towns ravaged by disease, in settlements where families starved during harsh winters. They appear as men, but they are not men. They speak of philosophy and theology with the knowledge of scholars, but their words are poison that corrupts the soul. They seek not to kill the body, but to damn the spirit, to convince good people that there is no God, no meaning, no hope. Father Santos's letters describe several direct confrontations with these entities, encounters that left him physically and spiritually drained. He developed what he called spiritual armor against their influence, a combination of prayer, fasting, and meditation that he claimed could protect against their psychological attacks. But even with these protections, he admitted that each encounter left him weakened and filled with doubts that took months to overcome. The priest's most detailed account describes an encounter in a Colorado mining town where a creature calling itself Dr. Mordecai Fell had been posing as a traveling physician. According to Father Santos, this entity had been systematically destroying the faith of the townspeople by engaging them in philosophical discussions that gradually undermined their belief in divine providence. The creature spoke with the voice of reason, Father Santos wrote, but its logic was the logic of hell. It presented arguments that seemed sound on the surface, but were designed to lead the listener into despair. It spoke of the meaninglessness of suffering, the absence of divine justice, the futility of prayer. Those who listened too long found their faith crumbling like sand, leaving them empty and hopeless. Father Santos's confrontation with Dr. Fell took place in the town church, where the creature had been holding what it called philosophical salons for the local intellectuals. The priest arrived to find the entity surrounded by a dozen townspeople, all listening with rapt attention as it expounded on the non-existence of God and the meaninglessness of moral behavior. I challenged the creature directly, Father Santos wrote, calling upon the name of Christ and demanding that it reveal its true nature. The thing laughed at me, saying that faith was nothing more than wishful thinking, and that prayer was simply talking to oneself. But when I began to recite the Psalms, it became agitated, its human disguise beginning to slip. The townspeople saw its true form then, pale and terrible, with eyes like cold stars and teeth like broken glass. The confrontation ended with the creature's retreat, but not before it had inflicted lasting damage on the community. Several of the townspeople who had attended its salons never recovered their faith, and the town itself began to decline as people lost hope and abandoned their homes. Within 5 years, the settlement was completely deserted, another ghost town on the frontier. Father Santos's accounts were initially dismissed by his superiors as the products of an overwrought imagination, but similar reports from other priests and ministers began to accumulate in church archives. By the turn of the century, the Catholic Church had quietly established a special office to investigate such phenomena, though its existence was not publicly acknowledged. The Protestant churches were slower to respond, but by 1905 several denominations had begun training ministers in what they called spiritual warfare, techniques for combating supernatural threats to faith and community. These training programs were based largely on the experiences of frontier ministers who had encountered the pale-eyed strangers and lived to tell about it. One of the most comprehensive accounts of these training programs comes from the journal of Reverend Joshua Whitman, a Methodist minister who served in Wyoming Territory from 1898 to 1912. Reverend Whitman had been specifically assigned to areas where supernatural encounters had been reported, and his journal provides a detailed record of his experiences and methods. "The creatures that prey upon faith are real," Reverend Whitman wrote in his journal entry for June 15, 1899. "I have seen them with my own eyes, spoken with their victims, witnessed the spiritual devastation they leave in their wake. They are not mere superstition or the products of frontier hysteria. They are genuine threats to the souls of good Christian people, and they must be fought with every weapon at our disposal." Reverend Whitman developed what he called the Three Pillars method for protecting communities against these entities. The first pillar was education, teaching people to recognize the signs of supernatural predation and to understand the tactics used by these creatures. The second pillar was community, strengthening the bonds between neighbors so that no one would face these threats alone. The third pillar was faith, helping people to develop a deep and unshakable belief in divine providence that could withstand even the most sophisticated psychological attacks. The Reverend's methods proved remarkably effective. Communities that implemented his Three Pillars program reported significantly fewer supernatural encounters, and those that did occur were less likely to result in lasting spiritual damage. Word of his success spread throughout the territory, and he was eventually called upon to train other ministers in his techniques. But Reverend Whitman paid a personal price for his work. His journal entries from his later years reveal a man who had been deeply scarred by his encounters with the pale-eyed strangers. He wrote of nightmares that plagued him for months after each confrontation, of doubts that crept into his mind despite his strong faith, of a growing sense that he was being watched and hunted by forces beyond human understanding. "I have looked into the abyss," he wrote in one of his final journal entries, dated November 23, 1911, "and I fear that it has looked also into me. Each encounter with these creatures leaves me a little less certain, a little more hollow. I pray that God will give me strength to continue this work, but I sometimes wonder if I am fighting a battle that cannot be won." Reverend Whitman disappeared in January 1912, while traveling between settlements in the remote northern part of the territory. His horse and wagon were found abandoned on a lonely stretch of road, but there was no sign of the Reverend himself. The only clue to his fate was a rocking chair that had been placed beside the road, carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The chair was examined by territorial authorities, but they could find no explanation for its presence or origin. Local residents reported that it would rock by itself on windless nights, and several claimed to have heard the Reverend's voice carried on the wind, warning travelers to beware of pale-eyed strangers who offered philosophical comfort to the spiritually troubled. The disappearance of Reverend Whitman marked the end of organized efforts to combat the supernatural predators that haunted the frontier. Without his leadership and expertise, the various church programs gradually disbanded, and knowledge of the creatures and their methods was largely lost. But the creatures themselves did not disappear. Reports of encounters with pale-eyed strangers continued throughout the early decades of the 20th century, though they became less frequent as the frontier was settled, and the old isolation of ranch life gave way to more connected communities. The advent of the automobile and the telephone made it harder for these entities to find the kind of isolated, spiritually vulnerable victims they preferred. but they adapted to changing conditions, appearing in new forms and contexts. Urban ministers began reporting encounters with mysterious strangers who appeared in hospitals and nursing homes, preying on the sick and dying. Prison chaplains described pale-eyed visitors who came to counsel inmates, leaving them more hopeless and bitter than before. During the Great Depression, reports of such encounters increased dramatically, as economic hardship and social upheaval created the kind of spiritual vulnerability that these creatures seemed to feed upon. Soup kitchen workers reported mysterious volunteers who seemed more interested in destroying hope than providing comfort. Traveling evangelists described competitors who preached a gospel of despair disguised as rational philosophy. World War II brought a new wave of encounters as the trauma of global conflict created unprecedented levels of spiritual crisis. Military chaplains reported mysterious civilians who appeared on battlefields and in field hospitals, offering comfort that somehow made wounded soldiers feel worse rather than better. Homefront ministers described visitors who came to console grieving families, leaving them convinced that their loved ones had died for nothing. The pattern continued through the Cold War era, with reports of pale-eyed strangers appearing at nuclear test sites, in fallout shelters, and in communities affected by the fear of atomic warfare. The existential dread of the nuclear age seemed to provide these creatures with abundant opportunities to feed on human despair and spiritual emptiness. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a psychiatrist who studied these phenomena in the 1960s, theorized that the creatures represented a form of psychological contagion that spread through communities during times of crisis. These entities, whether real or imagined, she wrote in her 1967 book, The Pale-Eyed Strangers, A Study in Mass Hysteria, serve as focal points for collective anxiety and spiritual doubt. They embody our deepest fears about the meaninglessness of existence and the absence of divine providence. Dr. Morrison's research was groundbreaking in its systematic approach to documenting and analyzing these encounters. She interviewed hundreds of people who claimed to have met pale-eyed strangers, looking for patterns and commonalities that might explain the phenomenon. What she found was a remarkably consistent set of characteristics that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. The strangers, according to Dr. Morrison's research, always appeared during times of personal or community crisis. They were invariably described as pale, thin, and well-dressed, with unusually light-colored eyes that seemed to glow in certain lighting conditions. They spoke with educated accents and demonstrated extensive knowledge of philosophy, theology, and psychology. Most importantly, they seemed to possess an uncanny ability to identify and exploit their victims' deepest spiritual doubts and fears. What struck me most about these accounts, Dr. Morrison wrote, was not their supernatural elements, which could easily be dismissed as folklore or hallucination, but their psychological sophistication. These entities, real or imagined, demonstrate a profound understanding of human nature and the mechanisms by which faith and hope can be systematically destroyed. Dr. Morrison's work was controversial within the psychiatric community, with many colleagues dismissing her research as unscientific and her conclusions as fanciful. But her documentation of the psychological effects of these encounters was thorough and compelling, showing clear patterns of spiritual trauma that persisted for years after the initial contact. One of her most detailed case studies involved a man named Robert Chen, a Chinese-American engineer who had encountered a pale-eyed stranger during the construction of a dam in California in 1963. According to Chen's account, the stranger had appeared at the construction site claiming to be a safety inspector, but had spent most of his time engaging workers in philosophical discussions about the meaninglessness of their labor. The man spoke of the futility of human achievement, Chen told Dr. Morrison during their interviews. He said that all our great works would eventually crumble to dust, that progress was an illusion, that we were simply rearranging matter in increasingly complex patterns that ultimately signified nothing. His words seemed reasonable at first, even profound, but the more I listened, the more hopeless I felt. Chen's encounter with the stranger lasted only a few hours, but its effects persisted for years. He lost interest in his work, began drinking heavily, and eventually suffered a complete nervous breakdown that required months of hospitalization. Even after his recovery, he reported feeling a persistent sense of meaninglessness that no amount of therapy or medication could completely alleviate. "It was as if something had been taken from me," Chen explained to Dr. Morrison. "Some essential part of my humanity that allowed me to find joy and purpose in life. I could function, I could work, I could maintain relationships. But there was always this emptiness inside, this voice whispering that none of it mattered." Dr. Morrison documented dozens of similar cases, each following the same basic pattern of encounter: spiritual corruption and long-term psychological damage. Her research suggested that these experiences, whether supernatural or psychological in origin, represented a genuine threat to mental health and community well-being. But Dr. Morrison's work was cut short in 1969 when she herself reportedly encountered one of the pale-eyed strangers. According to her research assistant, Dr. Morrison had been working late in her office when a man claiming to be a colleague from another university arrived unannounced. The assistant heard voices from Dr. Morrison's office for several hours, but when she checked the next morning, she found the office empty except for a rocking chair that had not been there the night before. Dr. Morrison was never seen again. Her research notes were found scattered around her office, many of them partially burned, as if someone had tried to destroy them but had been interrupted. The rocking chair was examined by university security, but they could find nothing unusual about it except for some strange symbols carved into the wood. The chair was eventually donated to a local museum, but it was removed from display after several visitors complained of feeling disturbed or depressed after viewing it. The museum director reported that the chair seemed to rock by itself when the building was empty, and security guards refused to work alone in the gallery where it was stored. The disappearance of Dr. Morrison marked the end of serious academic research into the pale-eyed stranger phenomenon. Without her documentation and analysis, the encounters were once again relegated to the realm of folklore and urban legend. But the reports continued, adapting to new times and circumstances. In the 1970s and 1980s, pale-eyed strangers were reported at anti-war protests and civil rights demonstrations, appearing as sympathetic listeners who gradually convinced activists that their causes were hopeless and their efforts meaningless. During the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s, they were seen in hospitals and support groups, offering comfort that somehow made patients and families feel worse rather than better. The advent of the Internet age brought new opportunities for these entities to spread their influence. Online forums dedicated to philosophy and theology began reporting the appearance of users who seemed to specialize in undermining faith and hope through sophisticated arguments disguised as intellectual discourse. These digital encounters followed the same patterns as their physical counterparts, leaving participants feeling spiritually empty and existentially hopeless. Social media platforms have become new hunting grounds for these creatures, with reports of accounts that seem designed to identify and target individuals going through spiritual crises. These accounts use profile pictures of pale, thin individuals with unusually light eyes, and their posts consistently promote nihilistic philosophies and existential despair. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a descendant of Ezra Blackwood who has studied her ancestors' story, believes that the pale-eyed strangers represent a form of spiritual parasite that has adapted to changing human society. These entities, whatever they are, seem to understand that faith and hope are essential to human psychological well-being. She wrote in her 2018 book, The Hunger for Faith: Spiritual Predation in the Modern World. White, they have learned to exploit our doubts and fears with increasing sophistication, adapting their methods to each new generation and cultural context. What remains constant is their goal: to convince good people that there is no meaning, no purpose, no hope, and no divine love in the universe. Dr. Blackwood's research has identified several common characteristics that can help people recognize and resist these entities. They typically appear during times of personal crisis or spiritual questioning. They demonstrate unusual knowledge of their victims' personal histories and psychological vulnerabilities. They engage in philosophical discussions that seem profound, but gradually lead to despair and hopelessness. Most importantly, encounters with them leave lasting psychological damage that can persist for years. The key to resistance, Dr. Blackwood argues, is to recognize that faith is not about having all the answers or understanding the meaning of suffering. Faith is about choosing to believe in love, hope, and meaning, despite the apparent evidence to the contrary. It is about maintaining our humanity in the face of forces that would reduce us to mere biological machines operating in a meaningless universe. Nair. Her work has led to the development of new therapeutic approaches for treating what she calls spiritual trauma, the psychological damage caused by encounters with these entities. These approaches combine traditional psychotherapy with spiritual counseling and community support, helping victims to rebuild their sense of meaning and purpose. But Dr. Blackwood acknowledges that the threat posed by these creatures is far from over. As long as human beings struggle with questions of meaning and purpose, she writes, as long as we face suffering and loss and death, there will be those who seek to exploit our spiritual vulnerabilities. The pale-eyed strangers are not going away. We must learn to recognize them, resist them, and help those who have fallen victim to their influence. The story of Ezra Blackwood and his encounter with the creature calling itself Josiah Crane serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of spiritual isolation and the importance of maintaining faith in the face of doubt. It reminds us that there are forces in the world, whether supernatural or psychological, that seek to destroy hope and meaning, and that our defense against them lies not in having all the answers, but in choosing to believe in love despite the darkness. Today, if you travel through the remote areas of Wyoming where Blackwood once lived, you might still encounter traces of his story. Local ranchers speak in whispers of the cursed land near Devil's Creek, where cattle refuse to graze, and strange lights are sometimes seen moving across the prairie at night. The site of his ranch remains empty, marked only by a circle of scorched earth where nothing will grow. And sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the moon is dark, travelers report seeing a rocking chair sitting in the middle of that barren circle, moving gently back and forth as if occupied by an invisible presence. Those brave enough to approach might hear whispers carried on the wind, voices speaking of philosophy and faith, of meaning and meaninglessness, of the terrible hunger that feeds on human hope. The chair is still rocking, they say, and somewhere in the darkness, pale-eyed strangers continue their eternal hunt for souls to corrupt and faith to destroy. But for those who remember Ezra Blackwood's story, for those who understand the true nature of the threat, there is still hope. Faith, after all, is not about having all the answers. It is about choosing to believe in love even when the world seems loveless, about maintaining hope even in the face of despair, about affirming meaning even when confronted with apparent meaninglessness. The pale-eyed strangers may continue their hunt, but they cannot touch those who truly understand that faith is not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that can overcome even the darkest forces that walk the earth. In the end, love is stronger than hunger, hope is more powerful than despair, and faith can triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. The stranger's chair may still be rocking, but it rocks empty now, waiting for victims who will never come, hunting for prey that has learned to recognize the hunter. And in that recognition, in that understanding, lies our salvation.